So yeah, I'm Andrew. I work for Liquid Intelligent Technologies as CTO of the R&D division, and I'm also one of the area directors in the IETF in the routing area, so I sit on the IESG. Having said that, I need to say that everything in this presentation is my opinions because I can't claim to represent the full IETF as with any AD. So what I want to talk a bit about today is what is the IETF and why should you be there? What is the advantage? And also a little bit about the process. Because if I look over the last day, I saw countless references to RFCs and various documents, etc. And I think a lot of people don't know how those documents come into being and how you can contribute to actually building those documents and help create those standards such that they fit your needs. So what is the IETF? So the IETF is the premier internet standards body, and it develops standards through open processes. It's a large open community. Vendors, operators, network designers, researchers, and more. There's no limit on who can contribute to the IETF. Now, in this bullet point, I highlighted open to any individual and in providing technical contributions. And those highlights are important because when you go to the IETF, you're not participating in the IETF as your employer, as Cisco, as Juniper, as Liquid. You're contributing as an individual. And that's an important distinction because your ideas and what you put out there are representative of your views, and hopefully that's where the consensus comes from. You can't go there and say, because my company is giant and huge, I somehow have more say than somebody else. It doesn't work that way because each individual has their own voice within the IETF, and it's a really, really important point. I also highlighted the technical contributions, and this comes down to a lot about how consensus is built within the IETF when we're building these documents. If you support a document and you go, well, I'm going to +1 support for this document, and you get 50 other people to do it, but one person has a technical objection to that document and it's a valid technical objection not addressed, your +1s are not meant to count because it's not a technical contribution. Your contributions in support for documents, against documents, etc., need to be technically based and technically founded. The mission of the IETF is to make the internet work better through the production of high-quality, relevant technical documents. Whether or not we always get that right, well, that's another question, but we try. And there are a lot of checks and balances in how the documents are created, the consensus formation, to try and ensure that the quality of the documents is there. When we do get it wrong, there is a process for submitting erratum and trying to get things fixed, but generally you hope that you don't see too many erratum. Doesn't always work, but well, we try. So why open standards? Open standards are the bedrock of the internet. In order for the internet to function, you have to have interop. Essentially, the internet is made up of a bunch of communicating nodes, and it's similar to if you take a bunch of people that don't speak the same language and you put them in the room, they're probably not going to get terribly much done. There has to be a common language. And that's where the standards come in. And it's important because if your router speaks BGP3 and mine speaks BGP4, well, it's probably not going to work. There has to be a standardized interface there. Open standards also allow operators a choice of vendor, a choice of hardware, and a choice of implementation without being locked into a particular vendor. Vendor lock-in costs money, a lot of money, because once a vendor realizes that you are locked to them, you've got no negotiation power. You've got no leverage anymore. Your leverage as a provider with vendors is because you can say, you know what, I'm walking away, I'm going somewhere else, I can buy another piece of hardware. And in this pandemic environment with a supply chain shortage, that's even more important, because I can't buy from vendor X, so I go and buy another piece of hardware that I can get and plug it into the network, and I know because of the open standards it's going to work. Well, in theory, provided that the vendors have followed the standards. That's another question altogether. But essentially, standards are the glue that allow operators to avoid getting locked in to someone, to a particular vendor. What the IETF is not, and this is important, we are not the protocol police. The IETF does not police protocols. The IETF develops standards. They do not, cannot enforce compliance with those standards. The demand for compliance with standards has to come from the operators. This means that the operators have to know what the standards say. So if your equipment is malfunctioning because the standard isn't being followed and the vendor has claimed compliance with a particular standard, you have the standards document and you can go and say to them, you claimed compliance with the standard, but you are not complying. And that is another reason why these documents are so important. I've had instances where a vendor has got an entire sheet of compliance of this document, and this document, turned it on, it hasn't worked. And I've been able to go back to them and said, you represented that you supported this, you didn't. Please take your hardware away or fix it. And it gives you options. And it's a really important point. So you have to demand that compliance because the IETF can't police protocols. Some core philosophies of the IETF: it's open to anyone who wants to contribute. You can get on a mailing list and start contributing right now. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what organization you come from, it is open to anybody who can contribute. Contributions to the IETF are made by individuals, not corporates, as I said earlier. And contributions are weighed on technical merit, not their source. So if your contribution is technically founded and has good technical grounding, it will be given far more weight than who you work for, in theory. That's the way that we try and operate. Decisions in the IETF are made by consensus, and for consensus to be achieved on a document, all the issues have to be addressed. That doesn't mean they have to be resolved, because there are many times where you will get a lot of issues that quite frankly can't be resolved, but they can be addressed to the satisfaction of everybody in the working group working on the document. And that is very, very critical. Just because you object to something doesn't mean that you get to block the document on an objection. If the working group decides that your objection can potentially be lived with, then it's been addressed, but it has to be addressed. One of the things that we say at the IETF is we reject kings, presidents, and voting. Everybody's equal here. It's consensus. What we do believe in is running code and rough consensus. That means if you're going to propose something, be willing to show that it works. Produce some code, right? If you can't produce the code, maybe you can get somebody who can, etc. But if you come with a proposal for something and you come with running code, you're going to get a lot further than if you've just got a document with no running code and no implementation. It's not always the case, depends on the working group, but as a general rule, and I think Ben will agree with me on this, that running code will take you a lot further, and there are people you can work with on that. So a quick crash course in how the IETF works, and this is a very high-level summary because of time and it's complicated, but effectively the IETF is divided into a series of functional areas, which is a structure controlled by the Internet Engineering Steering Group, which is comprised of all the area directors who are appointed by the NOMCOM's 2-year terms, and you can get more than one term, etc. At the current time, there are various areas within the IETF. You've got applications in real time, general area, internet area, operations and management area, routing area, security area, and transport area. Each area deals with a different aspect of standards. Now, there's also a lot of crosstalk between these sometimes. And in fact, there can even be documents where you kind of debate, where does this belong? Had this incident with a document at the moment that I've been debating with Mark and Ben, where I looked at it and I went, does this really belong in operations? And if it does, it should be this document type versus maybe it's actually changing something in BGP, in which case it belongs in this area. So it can depend on what the document is, where it belongs, etc. Each of these areas has loads of working groups, though, and again, it'll depend what your document is, which working group it goes into. The technical work happens within these working groups, and the working groups operate via mailing lists. Also, IETF does meet in person 3 times a year. They're all hybrid meetings now, so you can attend those meetings either remotely or in person. But the technical work happens within those working groups, and it's the consensus of the working group that you're looking for. Each working group has an agreed charter that defines its scope and its milestones and objectives. All those charters of the working groups are all public. You can go and read them, get a good idea of what the working group does. Participation in those working groups is primarily done on the mailing list. There's very, very seldom a decision made in the public meeting because those decisions, consensus calls, etc., happen over time. And it takes time to gauge consensus. So all of that stuff is actually happening on the mailing list. So your in-person participation, while valuable for various reasons I will get into, is not at all necessary for contributing to the IETF. I point out that there is one particular individual I know of who has 30-something RFCs and has been to one IETF in his life, and, it happens. So you can contribute just on the mailing list, which costs nothing. And as I said, decisions are made by consensus. There's no concept of a vote. What they do sometimes do is what's called a hum, where when they want to gauge within a meeting whether or not there is support for something, they'll call for a hum for and against and gauge the volume of the hum. It's a IETF peculiarity. Ben's having a good laugh, trying to explain the hum. So there's no concept of voting, though. Voting does not have a place within the IETF. The IETF also has various document tracks. You have your best common practice, which are BCP documents. You have your standards documents. Standards track documents, let me be specific, because standards track is actually divided into 2 levels of maturity, proposed standard and standard. I think that last time I checked, there are only about 90 standards documents. It's a long time to get to a full standard. Pardon? Oh, okay, yeah, standard 95, there we go. And then you've got experimental documents, and these are documents which are published to document research or developmental efforts. They still have to have consensus on an experimental document, but it's not necessarily a full proposed standard because it's subject to change, etc. Then you've got the informational track, and informational documents are there for general information for the internet community. They're not subject to internet community consensus. They do not represent a recommendation by the IETF or the IETF community, but it is an option there to publish informational documents for general good information. From an idea to a proposed standard, basically a document's written up and it's submitted to a particular working group, and if you don't know which working group it's going into, you can send it into a dispatch group and they'll tell you where it belongs, or if it belongs at all. And sometimes I've also seen documents go into dispatch that have resulted in the creation of working groups because there was nowhere else to put them. That does actually happen, not frequently, Well, in the general area, it happens more often, but it does happen. But it goes into the working group, and if there's consensus within the working group that the idea has merit and it's within charter, then the working group adopts the document. Now, this is actually a pretty key step, because once the document is adopted by the working group takes over the document. The document ownership moves to the combined working group, not the author anymore. So at that point, anything that the author or the editor of the document puts into the document has to reflect the consensus of the working group. They no longer have control of their document, effectively. Once the working group adopts the document, as I said, the ownership sits with the working group as a collective. Each iteration of the document, each new submission gets a new ID, so that there is always a track of how did this document develop, and references to the mailing list, etc. You can see why it changed, what was changed, what the objections were, etc. Once there's working group consensus on an iteration of the document that they feel this is now done, there's a last call in the working group, and everybody says, I support this, I don't, are there any objections, etc. If that passes, it then moves to an IETF last call, which is a last call across the entire IETF. Again, if there's consensus there, again done on the mailing lists, it then's passed to the IESG. And the IESG's job is to do a kind of final review. The area directors are required to ballot on the document. Now, this isn't a vote as such. The area directors get to say, we don't object to the document, we abstain from saying anything about this document, or we discuss this document. And I raise this because it's actually really important, and it's something that as an area director we run into all the time when people get to the stage where it's past IETF last call and they go, great, everything's done. Well, no, not so much. When an area director chooses to hit that discuss button, yes, it blocks the progression of the document until the discuss is resolved, but there's a reason that it's called discuss, because it puts the onus on the area director to then go and discuss and find a resolution to their point of contention. And a classic living example of this right now, Mark Tinker and Randy Bush and some others have a document that they put through the CyberOps working group, and there was some normative language in there that I wasn't particularly happy with, and I hit the discuss button. And I then discussed with Mark, we kind of came to a compromise, and then Ben decided to get difficult and not like the compromise and told me not to release the discuss, so Mark blamed Ben. And then we had to start all over again, some more discussion, etc. And now we have an agreement, and I'm waiting for an update, at which point I'll release the discuss, and the document becomes an RFC. Any area director at that point in the process can hit discuss, but for a specific set of reasons. I don't have the URL for the reasons, but there are a very specific reason why you can hit a discuss. I can't hit a discuss just because I don't like your document. You know, that's, I have to honor the consensus of the IETF in general. And then once all the discussions are concluded, the document becomes an RFC. So why participate in this process? Because all of that process and all of that long spiel that you go to finally get that RFC has to have a purpose. Firstly, stronger standards allow for easier operations. Networks are collaborative entities. If the standards are followed, simply put, things work better with less complications. Standards allow for the creation of products that are not tied to single vendors. If you go and use a single vendor and you build your products on proprietary technology and you're selling those products, again, you've lost all your leverage, because now you're tied to that vendor, and that vendor can start charging you whatever, and effectively that vendor, you've handed that vendor control of your own product suite at that point. That is not sane business practice to do that. You want to be able to build your product on open standards. And sometimes the standards aren't there to allow you to do it and have to be created. And you can wait for your vendor to go and create that standard, and you may or may not get what you want at that point. Or you can step up to the plate and go and say, I need this, and I'm going in there to try and get a standard created that works for what I want. Obviously, that's still subject to the consensus process. The working groups are still going to have to agree that this is useful. But the point is, you get a say, and that's important because it's those standards that allow you to build your products where you make your money. Standards should cater for functionality in different operational environments. The thing is, every environment that we work in has different constraints and different problems. And ideally, a standard will allow you to operate in those different environments. And there's a good example at the moment of a working group that we're working towards the formation of for something called time-variant routing. And time-variant routing is essentially designed such that if you know that there are rolling blackouts and you're going to be blacking out at this point and this point and this point and this point, you can withdraw the routing there before that blackout happens and avoid a potential hit during switchover and outages, etc. There's also a dual purpose for that working group, by the way, and it has to do with satellite technology, because satellites go in and out of, as things orbit, etc. So this is a standard that is now being developed to deal with two problems that will allow for more conducive operation within particular environments. And it was quite interesting because when this was originally proposed, it was proposed in the context of blackouts and green energy discussions, etc. And somebody went, hold on a sec, I've got a use for this in satellite. And the use case for it became stronger, and the case to build a working group on this and build documents became stronger because people were prepared to see somebody had an idea, I can contribute to this, I can build on it, I can do something with it. Then there is another point as to why you participate, and this is probably more important than any other point. The standards process builds relationships. When you step into the IETF, you're stepping into a world of 1,500, 2,000 of some of the smartest people on the planet. And there were a lot more people than 1,500 or 2,000, but kind of that's what appears at a meeting, And you build the relationships with those people. And those relationships can take you a long, long way. I'm sure if you speak to Ben, or you speak to Mark, or you speak to myself, a lot of what we manage to accomplish on our networks and in our day-to-day jobs has to do with the vendor relationships and the relationships with various people that we can pick up the phone and when we've got a problem and go, listen, I've got a problem, nobody else is helping me solve this, help me solve it, and you've got the resources. Nowhere will build you those relationships better than the IETF. Nowhere on the planet, because the right people and the power players and the power brokers and the people who have the facilities to go out and make the changes are all there. So the IETF and being there is probably the best relationship building exercise you could ever engage in, and that is well worth the investment. So how to participate? Find your areas of interest. Look at the areas, look at the working groups, decide what fits your interest areas and skills. Subscribe to the mailing lists. Read. Before you can participate in a working group, before you send random emails to it, take the time to read the documents that are being discussed. Understand them, research them, look at them. Takes a bit of effort, but you will be so much more successful if you take the time to go through those documents and related documents first. Make sure you read the contributions of others and understand that to which you are contributing, because you cannot read RFCs in isolation of one paragraph and make a comment. You need to read the document. Take that time and effort. It's worth doing. Attend a meeting if you can. Participation can be done entirely by mailing lists. You can also attend remotely if you wish. If you can be there, though, that really helps, particularly in the relationship building side. But if you can't get on a plane, as I said, all the meetings now, particularly since COVID, have been structured to be completely hybrid meetings. And here's the thing. The remote meeting participation, there is now a fee waiver. This is an honor-based system, by the way. We ask that if you can afford to pay to be at the remote attendance fee and your company is willing to pay it, pay it. The IETF and running it isn't cheap. If you can't, however, you can go and apply for a fee waiver. It'll ask you why you're asking for a fee waiver. You can put in anything. No one's reading that, I promise you now. You will get a fee waiver. And attend, you know. All we ask is that if you take a fee waiver, that you actually show up and attend a couple of sessions. And I think that that is a perfectly fair ask. Finally, there's some reading material for afterwards. The DAO of the IETF is a long document, a very long document, but it'll tell you everything you could ever possibly want to know about the IETF and all sorts of things you probably don't want to know about the IETF. It's a really long document, but it's a good document to go through, and you can pick and choose the sections that you read. There's a link in this, and these slides will be available afterwards, to what the standards process is, and there's a list of active working groups. I'd also say that if you want to participate, find someone who knows the IETF, that can mentor you, that can help you. And I promised Ben I would do this. For those of you in Cape Town, there's Ben over there. He told me that he had no problem doing this, and he would happily mentor people in IETF. I'm also nominating Mark. He's done some work in the IETF. Where I can, I will always attempt to help. Obviously, at the moment, with the AD role, I spend about 8 hours a day doing IETF work, so my time is kind of limited, but I will help. And finally, thanks, and feel free to reach out for more information. And I hope to see you all at the next IETF, which, by the way, is in London in November. Alternatively, Okinawa in March, San Francisco next year, June, and Prague in November after that. Hopefully see you all there. And yeah, that's a little bit about the IETF. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Unfortunately, we've lost our main opening questioner. So the rest of them probably won't have anything to say. But
Thanks, Andrew.
You're always good backup for me.
Ben, work online. Thanks. I think that was a really good summary of the reasons to be there. I think the only point that I would, so first of all, just a very logistical question. I thought it was, I've forgotten the name of the city now. I didn't think it was Okinawa. I thought it was, I can't remember where it was supposed to be, but I thought it was a different city in March. Are you sure it's Okinawa?
I can 100% check that, but I'm pretty sure that it's Okinawa. I may be wrong.
Okay, it's a good thing I haven't booked flights. I think one of the things that, there was a lot of focus in your presentation on contributing to documents being how you participate in the IETF. And I think that's a misconception that I had, and I think it's an important misconception to dispel. Contributions that don't involve authoring documents are super valuable. I have certainly personally had more impact on more documents that I do not appear on the author list of than I have directly authored myself. I have frequently identified something that I've wanted to do on our network for which no solution currently exists, but a solution that would solve or partially solve the problem exists. A bit like you were talking about the time-dependent networking stuff.
By the way, you were right, it's in Yokohama, sorry.
Is it in Yokohama? Okay, cool. And I've been able to identify the fact that there is a good fit there, and I've been able to kind of offer that up as a use case and thereby strengthen someone else's document, and provide, feedback on that basis. And that's a lot of the time, that's much more accessible. It's much less of a time commitment, and oftentimes it's more valuable, frankly. We don't need more documents. Mostly we need better documents.
Yeah, I think you make some very good points. When I refer to contributions, I didn't make that clear enough. A contribution can be simply a comment to the working group that says, this document could do with this change, could do with this addition, etc. And then the authors will put it into the document if the working group agrees. You don't have to go and write completely new standards. There are times for new standards. There are times where simply standards and ideas that have shown up could be better modified. And this is actually really, really important, because what you don't want is if you see a standards document proposed by vendor X and you are vendor Y, and you suddenly decide that, well, you've got a slightly better idea, you're not going to bother to ask for changes, you're going to go and put in a competing document. Please don't do that. It makes our lives as ADs hell itself. So yes, contributing to ask for changes is really important as well.
In a similar sort of a vein, you mentioned the rough consensus and running code thing. But the way you phrased it was that running code is something that you should bring if you're authoring a document. I think the reverse is true as well. Being the person that brings the running code is super valuable, because often you're in a smaller list of people that can make that kind of contribution. Yeah. We were, the subject of the ASPA spec came up quite a lot yesterday. And at the time, I was not an author on any of those documents, but I did write the first ASPA implementation, and that helped to move that forward. And the code that I wrote was subsequently used to test the code that they're running in the RPKI client project, which committed ASPA support yesterday. And so the implementations there have come out of participation in the IETF, but separately from any of the authors. And if you're in a position to do that sort of work, it's super valuable, especially if you care about moving something forward.
And I'll also say this, just in addition to what Ben has said. If you ever want to learn what it's like to read an RFC and understand it, or a draft, the fastest way to embed a technology into your head is to go and write an implementation of it. I realized that I thought I knew BGP. I didn't until the day I realized that I could now read BGP in hex. Writing those implementations teaches you a lot about the protocols, and it's worth doing, and it's a valuable resource to the community as well, to be able to say, I implemented this, here is some code. Be you an author or be you not an author, that is always useful and always appreciated.
And then I'll release the microphone in 1 second. I just want to say something quickly to add to the kind of evangelism thing. On this continent, in general, we are a consumer of technology rather than a producer of it. And as an operator community, we are too often a consumer of technology rather than an originator of it. And as African operators, we are both. We have a worse ecosystem because of a lack of involvement from the operator community, a substantially worse ecosystem. The fights between the vendors that we get caught between are a result of us not involving ourselves in the process early enough. So it is a really, I can't stress enough on an individual level and on an ecosystem level how important it is that there are more of us not representing vendors in the room early in this process. Yeah, I'm done.
And can I just plug Andrew's WhatsApp group for routing in the IETF for beginners? Yes,
we also have a WhatsApp group. If anybody sends me their number, I think, Ben, you're also an admin in there, so you can also add people to it. Oh, well, I'll make you one after this, so you can vote Ben as well. But you can join that WhatsApp group, and there were some really experienced people in there as well that you can ask questions of. I mean, really experienced people.
And unlike the IETF, it's very friendly. Not that I'm saying the IETF can be unfriendly.
Hi, Andrew. From my perspective, the IETF works. It has smart people, its processes works, and its rules about no kings and code running and so on works for it. My question to you, though, is do you think that the rough consensus model of the IETF is replicable in other organizations? I have one particular organization in mind, but as a general question, do you think all standards organizations should do that, or do you think there should only be one standards organization, or do you think the IETF is a miracle that it works as well as it does because of the smart people it has?
Okay, wow, that's a bit of a loaded question. Firstly, there are many SDOs, what we call Standards Development Organizations, and they have different ways of functioning. The IEEE is an SDO, essentially, as one example. MEF is another SDO, completely different functioning. With regards to the consensus-based approach, the organizations that choose to use the consensus-based approach, where it goes wrong is that I'm not sure that they entirely understand the process of what rough consensus means. And there are documents, there is an RFC describing rough consensus. Everything in the IETF has got an RFC, just by the way, like everything. And I think that if the chairs of organizations that are using that and choosing to claim it, study that document, it could work. It's not a case of rough consensus doesn't work. It's a case of chairs in certain organizations choosing not to understand what the rough consensus process is.
Thank you very much, Andrew.